Hola. You guys hear me?
And if I get jumbled up with these, I think this is actually the first time I've used note cards. So I'll do my best with them. Hang on, now this froze up. Come on. Okay, that's working. Okay. Lucien B. Wintrich, who is the DC Bureau Chief and White House correspondent for the Gateway Pundit, was invited to the University of Connecticut to speak to the students. It was just a normal event that the university would put on. They do plenty of other events like this, so it wasn't anything super special, and it was optional for the students to show up. Mr. Wintrich chose to speak about, the topic he chose was called "It's Okay to Be White," and if anything, this topic was made to bring unity to the student body. So Mr. Wintrich was just going through a speech as he had planned, but some members of the audience began to grow angry, among other things. Some members of the audience started to sneer at Mr. Wintrich, and about halfway through his speech, one of the audience members actually got up, approached Mr. Wintrich, took his notes, and proceeded to flee the auditorium. So instead of just letting this happen, Mr. Wintrich pursued the thief and reclaimed his notes using mild force, whatever is entailed by mild force. Whatever it was, Mr. Wintrich was actually arrested and charged with breach of peace. Excuse me, bad time for allergies to hit. Mr. Wintrich was arrested, charged with breach of peace, but he was soon after released on bond. And the person that stole his notes was arrested then and charged with larceny. So what this shows, among other things, is that society is broken, and any chance that somebody will get, they may try to bend rights or do whatever they can in their own power to, if somebody gets the chance, then they're going to try to make themselves feel better by getting rid of anything, race-based, anything that has to do with rights, legal rights, those sort of things. So without further ado, my name is Harley, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the issue with misinterpreting rights, freedoms, and liberties. Before I begin, I need to lay out some limitations. If anything, these limitations are just to help with the time constraints that I have, and also to aid with the overall clarity and understanding that you guys are going to get from this presentation. So first, I'm only going to be discussing events that take place in the United States. And this is because the United States, as American citizens, we operate under what is called a constitutional republic. So this form of government is pretty rare throughout the whole world. The United States is a very unique form of government when compared to other countries. So for this reason, because other people in other parts of the world operate under different laws, different restrictions, and those sort of things, I'm only going to be discussing events that take place in the United States. Second, I'm not going to be pursuing any sort of solvency, mostly because the issue that I'm discussing covers such a broad audience, which is the entire population of the United States. So for that reason, coming up with any sort of solution would be pretty difficult. And in my personal opinion, with the topic that I'm discussing with rights and freedoms, I don't think there really is a say-all solution, because there's always, with how many people I'm talking about here, there's always going to be some sort of, different mindsets between people. There's always going to be some sort of disorder in society. It's just how the world works. So I'm not going to discuss any solutions. Third, I'm not going to discuss any exceptions. And what I mean by exceptions are, for example, take illegal immigrants. Illegal immigrants, first, they are in the United States illegally, so they don't have any rights that are bestowed upon them. If you look at like immigrants that are applying for citizenship, during that period when they're waiting for their citizenship to be granted, these immigrants don't actually have all of the rights that they would if they were a full-time American citizen, just like me or you. So for that reason, because I have a different set of rights I'm not going to be discussing them because you have to kind of cater the discussion towards what they do have. So anything like that, whenever you're talking about people with a different set of rights than we do, I would call that an exception, so I won't be discussing those sort of things. In addition to these limitations, I would like to discuss history and background before I begin, just to give you guys, the audience, the best chance that you can have of understanding what I'm talking about to its fullest, just to aid in clarity and that sort of thing. With a political topic such as this, I feel that history and background is extremely important. For example, like if you look at a president that's in office, you can't really tell the full amount of good or bad that that president did until years after they've left office, because you have to see what they've done in office is carried out over time. Same with the discussions like this. When you're talking about rights and freedoms, you have to look at the history and how you got to the point where we are today with the rights that we have, instead of just looking at modern times, because that'll make it very difficult and not very clear. So some of the history that I'm interested in, at least for this topic, the first thing being the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was ratified on July 28th of 1868. And if you don't know, 1868 is during the Reconstruction era, which is just after the Civil War. So the 14th Amendment is important because of this, because during the Civil War, when pretty much the entire country was against African Americans, still thousands of African Americans fought and died in the Civil War for what they believed in, which is a country that would accept them one day. People recognize this, the sacrifices that these men made, and these people thought, okay, it's time to push something like the 14th Amendment. That's why I think this is important. So the 14th Amendment, I'll read you just a little excerpt from the amendment, because they are pretty long. It says, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." So in short, what this means is the 14th Amendment grants all citizens of the United States equal rights to life, liberty, which I will define shortly, and property. And the 14th Amendment grants equal protection under the law for everybody. So I think this is extremely important concerning the history of rights in America. Now, sadly, even though the 14th Amendment says that law now views all people as equal, sadly, not all people still view people as equal. So when you look at the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, you'll see just countless instances of discrimination against African Americans. In the 1960s were when many of the large movements started for African American causes, all that sort of thing. And even through modern day, I feel like the Civil Rights Movement really hasn't ended. If you look at modern day, you see like the Black Panthers, and you see all of these groups that are still promoting equality for African Americans and other races. So it's still very prevalent today. And also, before I begin, I would like to lay out some definitions to aid in the overall clarity and understanding that you guys receive from this presentation. So defining the word rights, I got this definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it reads, bear with me, it's pretty long. Rights are the interest in a claim which is recognized by and protected by sanctions of law that are imposed by a state, which enables one to possess property or to engage in some transaction or course of conduct, or to compel some other person to so engage, or to refrain from some course of conduct under certain circumstances, and for the infringement of which claim the state provides a remedy in its courts of justice. So basically what that is saying is that rights are, so a group of people takes interest in a claim, and let's say the claim would be that murder is bad. So a group of people take a look at this claim, they recognize the claim, and they take this claim to law, and the definition of rights says that that claim is then protected by law under each state. So basically the claim that murder is bad is protected by law as murder is illegal. So that's how rights work. Defining liberties from the Merriam-Webster dictionary is as follows: the state of not being imprisoned or enslaved, or the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions that are imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. And then finally, defining the word freedoms is the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. So just keep these definitions in mind. They'll help with the overall clarity of this argument. Now, whenever you look at a topic like the one I'm discussing right now with rights, liberties, and freedoms, I feel that there are three main ideas that need to be conveyed to you guys so that you can understand this argument to the fullest in the most understandable manner that you can. So the first of these ideas is that having a misunderstanding of rights, freedoms, and liberties is detrimental to oneself. The second idea is that an understanding can influence an entire behavioral standard. And the third idea being that the moral law inside of every person causes each person to acknowledge the difference between rights, freedoms, and liberties and why this difference is important. So moving on to that first point that I mentioned, a misunderstanding of rights, freedoms, and liberties is detrimental to oneself. I'll tell you a story that's an example of sort of how this idea plays out in everyday life. A man named Jack Phillips, who is a resident of Denver, Colorado, and owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop, was approached one day by a gay couple that was planning on getting married. Jack Phillips told this gay couple that he would not make them a cake because it clashed with his religious views. Instead of taking their business elsewhere, this gay couple managed to take their issue to a local district court. And in this court, the ruling was in favor of the gay couple, saying that Mr. Phillips had to make them a cake for their wedding. Mr. Phillips was not happy with this ruling, so eventually this issue was brought all the way to the Supreme Court by Mr. Phillips. And in this court case, the final ruling was, excuse me. In this court case, the final ruling was a 7-2 decision in favor of Mr. Phillips, saying that Mr. Phillips possesses the right of refusal to anybody that comes into his shop. Mr. Phillips in the Supreme Court did say, and I quote, "I do not discriminate. I serve everybody that comes into my shop. I don't create cakes for every message that people ask me to create." So he's saying here that he doesn't discriminate against people. He just won't make every single message that people ask him to make. And he went on to list other messages that he wouldn't tolerate. So it was nothing against the gay couple on his side, and the court recognized this, saying that the gay couple was wrong in assuming that Mr. Phillips had to make them a cake. In other words, the gay couple does not have the right to demand this service. Another example that may highlight this issue even better is the Whitney versus California case of 1919. Now, this is also a Supreme Court case, and in this case, a woman named Charlotte Anita Whitney was found as the alleged organizer of the Communist Labor Party of America. And the problem here, even though the party, including Miss Whitney, didn't do anything physically dangerous towards society or the government or anything like that, the sole idea with the Communist Labor Party was that Whitney was going to gather all of these people and motivate them to overthrow the American government and ultimately establish a communist regime. And this is obviously bad. It's more dangerous than just getting a group of people together and expressing your views, which is exactly how the Supreme Court viewed this issue. The Supreme Court said that Miss Whitney had uttered, where did it go? I'm sorry. The Supreme Court said, and I quote, "Miss Whitney made utterances inimical to the public welfare, tending to incite crime, disturb the public peace, and endanger the foundations of organized government." So in short, the court found that Miss Whitney was posing a threat to society, and the court did this, they made this judgment through the Holmes test of clear and present danger, which I'll get into later. It's an important way that the court judges what is right or wrong. That's a method. So the main takeaway from this is that Miss Whitney, as well as the gay couple that was confronting Mr. Phillips, both assumed the rights that they actually did not have. Miss Whitney assumed the right of free speech. She assumed that she was using free speech and motivating these people to overthrow the American government, when in fact she had overstepped her rights. And if she would have understood her right of free speech, then she may not have been arrested as she was. Now, when looking at something like this, someone may say that it doesn't really matter if you understand your rights, freedoms, or liberties, as long as you conduct yourself according with the law. And while this is true, you still need to understand, in order to understand how to conduct yourself under the law, you need to understand the laws that are in place and how the rights, freedoms, and liberties that you have under the law affects your everyday life. Focusing a little bit more on rights, some people may say that free speech, the right of free speech, should be boundless or without restriction. While this does sound really nice, it can prove to be very dangerous to society, just as we saw with the Whitney versus California case. Free speech was actually intended by the founding fathers to be a limited right as opposed to unlimited. The founding fathers intended that free speech would be utilized by the American people so that the people could express their views without being in danger. An example of the danger that I've mentioned would be like back in Britain or England before the United States was colonized. If you expressed a bad view of yours about the government, then you may be facing the guillotine just for expressing your own view. In America, the founding fathers didn't want this to be the case. So free speech was intended to be limited in the sense that you couldn't do what Miss Whitney did and pose a threat to society through your speech. But the founding fathers wanted speech to be so that you could express your views without being scared of what may happen. Moving on to the second point, that is how having an understanding can influence your behavioral standard. I'd like to show you an example or a study that was conducted by Dr. Carol Dweck. She is the professor of psychology at Stanford University. Now, Dr. Dweck had noticed that some of her students would be completely devastated by failure in a class, while some of the other students would just brush it off and not really care. And on the surface, this seems just like an everyday thing. You know, some students just care about their work more than others. But Dr. Dweck wanted to dive deeper, and she found through something that she coined the growth mindset that, well, let me explain the growth mindset. Dr. Dweck says that the growth mindset is when a student believes that they can get smarter, they understand that effort makes them stronger. Therefore, they put in extra time and effort, and that leads to higher achievement. So if you apply this finding to the political world, what you're going to see is that pursuing political knowledge in the field of rights, liberties, and freedoms will allow a person to better conduct themselves under the law. In other words, if you're pursuing knowledge about what your rights are, what your freedoms are, then you will be better suited to conduct yourself under the law because you're going to know better what you can or cannot do. So this is in direct alignment with the growth mindset that Dr. Dweck realized in her study. Another case that shows how important an understanding is in any situation is the Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer case of 1988. Now, this is a Supreme Court case, and this case consisted of a school administration and the student body. So in this case, the school administrators deleted roughly 2 pages from the student newspaper, and some of the topics that were included in these pages were teen pregnancy and abortion. And the school administrators thought that these topics weren't fit for the student newspaper for obvious reasons. Now, the student body, specifically the writers of the newspaper, became outraged whenever they learned that the administrators had taken pages out of their paper. And instead of just submitting to the authority, the students managed to take their issue to a local district court, claiming that their right of free speech in the newspaper had been infringed by the school administrators. The local court actually ruled in favor of the student bodies, and in doing so, the local district court treated the right of free speech as an unlimited right instead of a limited right, which, as we know, the right of free speech is a limited right. The school administration was not pleased with this ruling, so the school administrators took this case all the way to the Supreme Court. And at the court, the ruling was a 5-3 decision. One of the court members was vacant. So the ruling was a 5-3 decision in favor of the school administration. The Supreme Court said, and I quote, that the school may suppress speech if it is not consistent with the school's guidelines. If the students would have recognized this right off the bat, then any complications with the law could have been avoided. But because the students were adamant that their right of free speech had been violated, then the following court cases resulted and made the student body look very bad. But the final takeaway from this case is that if the students would have understood their rights in the first place and understood that they were wrong in assuming that they had an unlimited right of free speech, then any complications could have been avoided with the school administration. Now, when you look at a topic like this, saying that an understanding has a big influence on how you behave personally, someone may say, well, truth is subjective. And they may make this argument saying that, well, what I believe may be different than what you believe. So what you say doesn't matter as much for me as it would for you, that sort of thing. And saying that truth is subjective introduces, it introduces moral skepticism to the argument. A man named Derek Mueller wrote an article about why he believes truth is subjective, and he said that cognitive ease, as he coined it, is why truth is subjective. And he says, Mr. Mueller says that cognitive ease is a fancy way to describe how hard your brain has to work to perceive information. And basically what he's saying here is that if your brain has to work hard to perceive whatever information is being thrown at you, then that information is probably false. Now, if you think about this claim, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, your brain has to work on hard stuff on a day-to-day basis. So it's kind of like looking at a hard math problem. If you think, well, this math problem is hard and I don't understand it, that doesn't mean the math problem is false. It just means you don't understand the problem. So to say that cognitive ease is reason enough for truth to be subjective, that's a flawed reason. As we know, truth is absolute. In any given situation, there's always a truth, and whatever you think about that situation doesn't change the truth of the situation. So looking at my third point, which is the moral law that is in every person will ultimately guide each person to do the right thing instead of the wrong thing. I want to show you a study that was done by Oliver Scott Curry of Oxford University. In this study, Mr. Curry found that there are generally 7 moral codes that exist in every person. And he said that understanding the 7 moral codes will allow a person to better carry out each code in their daily lives. Now, these 7 codes, I'll read them off to you. The first says that people will help their family, people will help their group, people will return favors, people will be brave, people will defer to their superiors, people will divide resources fairly, and finally, number 7, people will respect others' property. Now, I want to focus on number 7, which says people will respect others' property. If you're going to respect somebody else's property, then you need to have a full understanding of the rights that people have to their property. And this ties back to how you have to know, how you have to understand your rights, liberties, and freedoms under the law. So to respect others' property, you have to understand the rights that other people have to that property. And as Mr. Curry says, understanding the 7 moral codes will allow you to better carry out each moral code in your daily life. And the way that you judge, for lack of a better word, these moral codes is through the morals that exist inside of you as well as everybody else. Another way that you can see this is by looking at the government and how they enforce law. So the claim that I'm going to make is that government naturally enforces morality. So government enforces a law. So you have to look at a law. What is a law? Well, law, as I said earlier, is a claim that is looked at by a group of people. And when the people look at this claim, they ask, is it right or wrong? Now, to judge whether a claim is right or wrong, you have to judge it by a moral standard. Now, a moral standard has to be above you. Otherwise, you would be saying, you would be judging what is right or wrong. And that would mean that truth is subjective. And as we've established, truth is absolute. So you have to look at a moral standard that is above yourself, which I believe to be God. So to make law, government has to use a moral standard. So in enforcing the law, the government is naturally enforcing morality. In other words, the choices that the government makes in order to decide what should be legal and what should be illegal are made in reference to a standard morality, and that is sourced from Deuteronomy. Now, in refutation, some may say that a flat blanket morality doesn't exist. People will say that people are generally going to feel different about certain things, and that's understandable. That's true. Not everybody feels the same. But all of mankind still operates in reference to a standard moral code, and this can't be ignored. Saying that this doesn't happen introduces moral skepticism. And let me define moral skepticism. Moral skepticism names a diverse collection of views that deny or raise doubts about various rules of reason and morality. So to say that a flat blanket morality does not exist, you are basically, according to moral skepticism, saying that reason and morality don't go hand in hand. But that's obviously false, because without morality, you don't have reason. Without reason, you don't have a good morality. So to say that a flat blanket morality does not exist, in order to dismember the moral law argument, that doesn't stand. So the main takeaway is that all of mankind operates in reference to a standard moral code that exists inside of you. So just as Lucian Whittrich saw at the University of Connecticut, society is broken, and now is a more important time than ever for people to understand the rights, freedoms, and liberties that they have. I've told you why misunderstanding of rights, freedoms, and liberties is detrimental to oneself. I've told you that understanding or having an understanding can influence a behavioral standard. And I've told you how the moral law guides people to do right or wrong. I'll leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." Thank you. Any questions?
Harley, good job. You've done some legwork on that since we last visited that. Impressive.
I tried to.
Good job.
Thank you.
This isn't, we've had this discussion several times. I find this particular topic in your arguments fascinating. They're almost circular because there's no solution, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
Something struck me as I heard this all put together, though. Kind of tying this together under the moral umbrella that you're using. I agree that the law is based on moral, but do you feel like that this current phenomenon we see is an attempt to make law an amoral entity, absent of all morality and strictly objective?
Could you specify the phenomenon that you're talking about?
Law in large part is trying to determine culpability, degrees of guilt or, that kind of thing. We see a lot of things now that are an attempt to absolve man of responsibility and lay responsibility off on something or someone else. Is that an attempt to make law amoral, do you think?
To that, I would have to say, because I do understand what you're saying about, especially in modern times, people try to basically find a way to blame problems on someone else, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So as far as the law is concerned with that, I would say that now is a more important time than ever to understand the rights that you have. Because if you don't understand these rights that you have, then it will be very easy, just as we saw with Mr. Phillips with the Masterpiece Cake Shop and the Gay Man. If Mr. Phillips had not understood his right of refusal as owner of that business, then the gay man could have ultimately it's not a horrible thing, but he would have had to make them a cake, because he would have had to say, well, oh, you're right, I have to. It's my duty as a business owner. So I would say that as far as people trying to justify themselves under the law or make it sound like they're right, you have to know your rights, just like Mr. Phillips did.
Okay. What's the most interesting thing that you came across when you're pursuing this whole concept? Is there any one particular takeaway?
Let me think. There was a handful of stuff, because when you get into the certain, like, court cases, for example, and you start seeing just how people would try to justify themselves. Like there's a man named Matthew Holden. He's going to be sentenced to jail on, I think, May 22nd of 2020, so very soon. And he he's being sentenced to jail for burning down Baptist churches and taking videos and posting these videos. And he tried to justify himself in saying that he was told by some higher power, not a human, like a deity, that he had to do this. I would say stuff like that is pretty interesting, how people try to justify themselves. That doesn't make it any better. You're still burning down churches. So I would say along this way, I've seen a lot of interesting cases and things like that, just how confused people can get under the law and try to make it seem like what they're doing is right. It's pretty interesting.
Good point.
And I think that just makes it all the more important that you have to have a good understanding of what you can and cannot do as far as rights, liberties, and freedoms go.
Harley, good job, man. I enjoyed listening to you. You picked a tough topic. This was very, very intriguing. I think, and I'd like your comment on this, it seems like this misunderstanding of rights has led to, like in the cake lawsuit, almost a bullying mentality that you have to do what I want because it's my right to get what I want. And it also has kind of lended to the whole entitlement mentality that we see in our culture today. For example, free healthcare. I have the right to free healthcare. Can you comment on that, kind of what you see in our culture?
Yes, sir. I would definitely agree. We have a more entitled culture now than ever. And because of that, we see, like you pointed out, the instance with Mr. Phillips and his cake shop. We see a lot of demand going around, but this demand usually isn't backed up by the rights that you have. I mean, people assume rights all the time, and can you all still hear me? I said the internet cut off. And I would say that I'm starting to sound like I'm repeating myself, but now more than ever, you have to understand the rights that you do and don't have. Otherwise, I mean, it's really easy as human beings to, it sounds good to do what you want. And people will, more times than not, try to get what they want if they think they can do it. So if you don't understand the rights that you have from law, then it's very easy to accidentally think that you're operating under a right and do that to try to get what you want. So it's dangerous. I mean, you do have to be careful because it's easy to do on accident, even if you're not consciously trying to, as you said, bully to get what you want. You can do it by accident, which is why it's super important to understand the rights that you do and don't have.
Good job. Thank
Harley,
you.
great job. You really did
Thank
a great
Hey,
job.
I have a question.
Great topic, great presentation.
In a minute.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and my question that I have, in the public school system, what we see happening, especially in the elementary school grades, is that history is not taught, social studies is not taught. It has been forsaken in order to concentrate on reading and math, because those two areas are tested. And math with the infamous STAR test. So so kids are that's lacking. That education is lacking. What would you say needs to happen in order for us as a society to educate people who have not had that opportunity to learn our history?
Okay, so
because that's how we develop moral law. Yeah, because what's happening is that we are not being educated about the assuming. In other words, people are assuming our rights and our freedoms, but they have no education of what our rights and our freedoms are. They've not been taught the Constitution in many cases. They're tested in history for the very first time. I think it is in 7th grade or 8th grade.
Okay.
So that's a lot of kids that are not being educated.
So to that, I mean, that's a little bit of a touchy subject, just because it's one thing to say, you know, we've got to bring history back to schools, but to the kids that are already beyond that point, that haven't been taught our history, I mean, it's kind of hard to say you've got to stick them back in school or just throw all of this history on them wherever they're at in their schooling, because I mean, that's a hard thing to do. And
so that's a moral dilemma, correct?
Mhm.
You think?
Yeah, I would say. So, I mean, I would say to that group, whoever's affected in that group, I mean, they've just got to be surrounded by a group of people that can push them to understand their history, where they came from, how we got to where we are as a country today. But I would say, as far as the kids that are still in school that have the opportunity to learn, but the school is for some reason withholding our history from them, I would say like history is one of the most important subjects, because you've got to understand history to know what happened in the past to get where we are today as a country. You've got to be able to respect that, if anything. You hear people say all the time, history repeats itself. So you have to know, in history, you've got to know what has happened and how it's failed, first of all. You've got to be able to respect where we are today, because, I mean, oftentimes if you look at history and how people get to where they are, or the good things that a country has done, then you'll be better equipped to behave that way yourself. Like my second point, having understanding can help you better conduct yourself. In this
Absolutely.
case, understanding history will help you conduct yourself as a person, because you can see how stuff works in the past.
Thank you, Harley. I appreciate your answer to that. I threw that, I guess that ended up kind of being a roundabout way for us to, I'm just concerned that we have uneducated people all over now that are not aware of our laws and our Constitution. It's a concern.
Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Harley, do you see a difference between like your classmates? I mean, I was impressed with your being able to articulate so clearly that there is absolute truth and everything like that. Do you feel like most of your classmates are there, you know, like, as opposed to maybe your friends that have gone to school someplace else? Or do you think, I guess what I'm saying is, do you think Alpha Omega has influenced you in this way? Do you think your research influenced you? How do you think you got there?
I would say that going to school at Alpha has absolutely influenced me that way. Having teachers like Tim, first of all, I mean, he's a man that knows the ins and outs of all of these philosophical arguments better than anybody else that I know. So without having been introduced to him and his teaching methods, I probably wouldn't be able to make this argument. So I would say going to school at Alpha certainly helped with that. And I would say yes, going through the research that I had to do to put this argument together, I would say that it strengthened my knowledge in philosophical arguments such as truth. I would say it strengthened that a little bit, because whenever you start looking at real world instances where people try to bend truth to get what they want, some of those arguments kind of seem, you know, enticing. You read something and it actually sounds like it could work out, but you have to realize the actual truth in every situation. So I would say that putting together this research and going to school at Alpha has definitely helped a lot.
I was very impressed. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Harley, on a delivery note, I thought your control of the language was exceptional. I thought you were able to address a very, very difficult concept and articulate it quite well. And I thought you controlled the language very well. Very fluid, very fluid. Good job, dude. Impressed.
Thank you.
And that 30 minutes that you referred to earlier is now over.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Well done, Harley.
Thank
All
you.
right. If nobody else has got anything, we'll let Harley go and do his thing now. Good job,
All
bud.
right, very
Yeah.
good.
Thank you all.